From UFOs to psychic powers and government conspiracies, history is riddled with unexplained events. You can turn back now or learn the stuff they don't want you to know. A production of iHeartRadio.
Hello and welcome back to the show. My name is Noel.
Our good friend, ride or die colleague, Matt Frederick, is on adventures, but will be returning soon. They call me Ben. We are joined, as always, with our super producer. Today, it is Seth Nicholas Johnson, so give him an audible hello when you get the chance. In the meantime, and most importantly, you are here, and that makes this stuff they don't want you to know. Noel, I figured we'd start off today's episode with an email from one of our listeners. This comes to us from Claude G. Claude says, "Hey guys, I just listened to your latest episode about the possible inspiration for True Detective." We did that one a while back.
Yep.
And Claude says, "I enjoyed the episode, but was wondering if you had heard of another theory about the inspiration for the show. I was raised in Jennings, Louisiana. I live a few minutes away now, but still go there multiple times a week. Jennings' claim to fame, unfortunately, is a multiple murder case titled by the media The Jennings 8. Showtime has recently done a 5-part series on it and mentioned True Detective in one of the episodes. My family and I are personally connected to the story as one of the victims was a cousin of ours. Anyway, I was curious to see if you guys have heard of the connection to the TV series and our case. Thanks for your time, Claude." This is fascinating. Now, we did know a little bit about this, but we wanted to explore the case today. It's something that many people have heard of, but are maybe not intimately familiar with. And for this sort of episode, we do need to have a disclaimer at the top of the show.
It's true. Today's episode dives into some pretty disturbing stuff, stories of true crime, murder, drugs, and corruption. And the episode contains, at times, quite graphic descriptions of violence and assault, and it might not be suitable for all listeners. So, to start, what are the Jennings 8? In order to answer this question, please travel with us to Jefferson Davis Parish, Louisiana.
Here are the facts. Jefferson Davis Parish. It's located in southwest Louisiana, and it's a small place. You know, a parish is Louisiana's version of a county. It has a little more than 30,000 residents. The parish seat is a town called Jennings. It's the largest town in the area, but the population is still just a little over 10,000, according to the 2010 census. It's home to some notable individuals. I found one mysterious story here. A guy named Father Eugene John Herbert was a Jesuit missionary. He disappeared in Sri Lanka in 1990 during the country's civil war. He has nothing to do with this show today, as far as we know. Before the events disclosed in today's episode, Jefferson Davis, which was named after the former president of the Confederacy, it was one of those places you probably wouldn't be too familiar with unless you lived in the area. It made the news a couple of times for things like corrupt ticketing by local law enforcement. You know, we've all heard that thing where if you're a stranger to town, you're driving by and you've got plates from outside of the area.
Yep. Big old red flag. Target on your back, yeah.
And that's happened. You've driven through some of those areas in your travels, maybe to Athens or Augusta.
Sure.
Right?
I would imagine there'd be an argument to make that it's some form of profiling, but it's just, it's the rules kind of. It's like something you should expect probably.
And it's kind of difficult to prove too. Like many rural areas, you wouldn't see Jennings often in the national news. In fact, you could live your entire life here in the United States and never know this place existed.
Jefferson Davis isn't particularly large. In fact, it's not particularly wealthy either. And like so many other places in the United States these days, it had a pretty seedy underbelly. In the absence of prosperity, economic opportunity, jobs, it is a vacuum that is typically filled with drugs and crime and other types of black market trading, which grew into kind of an open secret in Jefferson Davis. Everyone knew what went down on South Main Street, but it wasn't necessarily something that was going to get shut down by the cops, on the regular, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, it was an open secret, especially in South Jennings. Life in this small parish seemed set to continue as it always had, and even to continue along a bit of a slow economic decline, until, that is, residents began finding the bodies. We're going to explore the initial murders, or the discoveries of the bodies, even before they were termed murders. On May 20th, 2005, there's a fisherman, a retired man named Jerry Jackson, who discovers the first body. It's floating in a canal off Highway 1126 on the outskirts of Jennings. This body is identified as one Loretta Lynn Chasson Lewis. Lewis had been seen alive 3 days earlier.
Because of the amount that her body had decomposed, authorities weren't able to conclusively determine her cause of death, but they suspected asphyxiation. And as you'll recall from our previous episode on the smiley face murder theory, drowning as homicide can be a pretty tough nut to crack. It's very difficult to prove, just like it's hard to prove that a cop pulls you over because you had out-of-state plates.
Mm-hmm. Yet the court of public opinion was already in full swing. And there's some pretty nasty victim blaming that happens, especially in the media, because according to the residents in the know, Lewis was living what was often euphemistically described as a, quote, high-risk lifestyle. She was addicted to crack cocaine. She was another casualty of the drug trade running along that corridor of I-10, and she had turned to the sex trade to feed her addiction. And at first, this was seen as a tragedy, and it is. But less than a few months later, residents and law enforcement started to recognize that this discovery wasn't just a singular tragedy. It was something else, the beginning of a pattern.
That's right. A group of friends hunting bullfrogs, which is a thing that you do in Jefferson Davis for fun. They found the corpse of a 30-year-old Ernestine Patterson, a few weeks later, floating in a different canal. This particular victim's cause of death was a bit easier to figure out. Her throat had been cut, her body brutalized. Two men, a Byron Chad Jones and Lawrence Nixon, are held for a brief amount of time on charges of second-degree murder. But these charges were, of course, dropped and they were released.
And so we have two discoveries in 2005. Years pass. On March 18th, 2007, another body is discovered, that of 21-year-old Kristen Gary Lopez. She is discovered in a canal, and like the Lewis case, medical examiners cannot conclusively nail down a cause of death. And, like in the Patterson case, two people are briefly detained. This time, it's a guy named Frankie Richard, who is described alternately as a retired oil rig worker, a strip club owner, and a pimp, along with his niece, Hannah Connor. These two are later released, just like in the Patterson case, due to lack of evidence.
Yeah, that's right. And over the next year and a half, 4 more bodies turned up in and around Jennings, all fitting the same profile, the same unfortunate kind of forgotten demographic. Poor, young, with a history of drug addiction, rap sheets a mile long, typically charges involving the sex trade or other criminal activities. We have Whitney Dubois, who was 26, Laconia Muggy Brown, 23, who, like Patterson, had her throat slit as well. Crystal Shea Benoit Zeno, 24. Brittany Gary, 17, who's the cousin of Kristen Gary Lopez. Most of these bodies showed almost no signs of trauma, And the medical examiners ruled asphyxiation as the cause of death. It's interesting.
Other than the Muggy case with the slit throat. So the law has to respond. Again, Jefferson Davis Parish has a small population. This death rate, this murder rate is insane. So in December of 2008, the Jefferson Davis Parish Sheriff's Department, under the leadership of one Sheriff Ricky Edwards, announces that they're forming a task force to investigate what they're now openly calling murders. This task force is referred to as Multi-Agency Investigative Team, or MAIT. They include local officials, state officials, and some feds. Their results leave much to be desired. In August of 2009, an eighth victim is found. Nicole Guillory, 26 years old. The body is discovered off I-10 in the adjacent Acadia Parish. Later that fall, Sheriff Edwards notes that these deaths may be the work of what they describe as a common offender, a single person committing the homicides. In other words, although they would hate to use the phrase, I'm sure, a serial killer. So that's where we're at that point. Between 2005 and 2009, 8 women have disappeared, only to be found dead shortly thereafter. The task force more than doubles their reward for information from $35,000 to $85,000, and the victims become collectively known in the zeitgeist as the Jeff Davis 8, or later, the Jennings 8. But this is only the beginning of the story.
In January of 2010, the New York Times reported on the deaths, and this article caught the attention of a New Orleans-based journalist named Ethan Brown. In 2011, Brown went to Jennings to do his own digging, his own interviews, his own investigations. Brown becomes obsessed with the story and convinced that there's more to it than what has already been reported.
And we'll explore Brown's investigation after a word from our sponsors. Here's where it gets crazy. So as this journalist, Ethan Brown, pores over public records, as he interviews numerous people affiliated with the victims, as he interviews members of the task force, and even suspects in the crimes, he begins to think this was not, in fact, the work of a serial killer, but of someone else. And it starts when he begins connecting dots between the victims. Because remember, this is a small town, and there's a reason we have stereotypes about small towns. One of the most common stereotypes about a small town is that there are no real secrets, that everyone knows everyone somehow. And a lot of our fellow listeners tuning in today probably have lived in a small town and can attest to that. You know, and then also there's the argument that every town you live in becomes smaller the longer you live there. So Brown starts to note that all these victims are connected. Noel, you mentioned that they had that demographic in common.
Right.
And they had similar issues with addiction and money. But he also finds that in addition to that first point, secondly, they had all served to some degree or another as police informants. What are they called? CIs?
Yeah, confidential informants. That's right. And that's the thing. I mean, a lot of times folks that are doing this kind of informing, they know each other and they're aware of each other and maybe have each other's backs in that respect because it is such a dangerous situation to be in. 2 were actually related, and another 2 lived together for a time in 2008. 4th, we've got multiple relatives who told Brown the victims had appeared unusually anxious or frightened before disappearing.
Yeah, and that 4th point, to be fair, is maybe a little more subjective because these people were living hard, difficult lives. You know, there were probably plenty of normal reasons to be anxious or frightened, but still, it fits the pattern. Let's pause here. Now, I know what you're saying, folks. Didn't you all just have a commercial break? Well, we do, but we also have an important announcement. You see, our good pal and colleague, Matt Frederick, has actually returned from his adventure. Oh, Matt.
I materialized. I'm here.
I didn't know we could all do that. I thought that was just a Ben power.
Well, I heard you guys talking about Ethan Brown, and I was like, oh, man, I got to get in there.
it is crazy that you showed up, but we're glad you're here.
It's also a very niche fascination to have triggered your spidey sense.
I mean, I have been reading about this case ever since I believe it was a listener mail that sent us
from
down
Claude,
sent us down this rabbit hole, and it's been disturbing me ever since. So thanks so much for sending it to us, and also no thank you, but thank you.
Yes, we opened the show with Claude's email, and now I don't think we need to catch you up on any of this, Matt, because you know it pretty well. So now we're at this point where Brown is making connections, right? He's connected some stuff about, he's corroborated some statements from relatives. He's noticed that there is a web of connection between the victims. He also finds another key connection, the Boudreaux Inn, just off of Interstate 10. It connects Houston to New Orleans. Could you tell us a little bit about that one?
So this is like one of the hubs, or possibly the hub of a whole drug and sex trade drugs. What do you call it? Not empires, but just where drugs are distributed pretty heavily. Police are always there, busting people for various things. Generally, it's for the sex trade or for drugs. Surprise, surprise. And several of the victims that have been identified in this case, or that are out there that he is kind of bringing together here, they've received complaints based on their behavior at this location. When we say complaints based on their behavior, we're talking, generally about sex work.
Well, yeah, and also loud hotel parties.
Yes, that's occurring here.
Depending on where you've spent time in the U.S. or abroad, you've probably seen motels like this before, typically right off the interstate, little beaten down, right?
Yeah.
And they don't have the best reputation, and they've earned that not the best reputation.
Well, and here's the deal too. It's a lot of times a community of its own, a motel like that.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of the victims here are sharing this web of people that they all are acquaintances with. And again, it's like, it's also a small town, right? It's this whole place we're talking about is small town, so all those rules apply. And in this case, within the drug trade itself, within the sex trade.
I mean, it's true. A lot of those very, let's call them affordable hotels, I guess, for lack of a better term, people stay there for long periods of time. They rent rooms weekly. And often there is like you said, Matt, kind of a hub where it's people kind of go in and out. Like, Johns will show up to this particular motel, to a particular room to get, sex work services, and same with drugs. And like you said, it becomes almost this community where everyone knows each other. Everyone is aware of each other's kind of comings and goings, right?
Exactly. These are good points because the victims also share a web of mutual acquaintances. The thing about these small town rules, the stereotype I mentioned earlier about everyone knowing everyone, is that this kind of rule applies to the criminal side of a small town as well, and it applies in the drug trade. That's what leads Ethan Brown to interview a friend of the victims, self-professed, the man we mentioned earlier, a strip club owner named Frankie Richards. And in his interview with Brown and with others, Richard paints Jennings in a grisly light. The drugs, the sex work, and the crooked cops, he argues, are operating more or less openly in Jennings and have been for some time before the killings begin. So Brown also finds that the rot in Jennings, Louisiana does not stop at the dirty banks of the canals. In 2014, in an amazing piece he wrote on Medium.com, we have a quote that helps walk us through his opinion on the law enforcement.
Since the early 1990s, there have been nearly 20 unsolved homicides, including the slain 8 women in Jefferson Davis Parish, a statistic in a competent sheriff's department that would be regarded as both a ridiculously low clearance rate and an astonishingly high murder rate for a small area.
Yeah, but Brown does not attribute these disturbing statistics to incompetence alone. As a matter of fact, he explicitly calls out law enforcement in this article.
Yes, he says, quote, "One fact is clear, local law enforcement is far too steeped in misconduct and corruption, and this extends to the task force, which is dominated by detectives and deputies from the sheriff's office to run an investigation with the integrity that the murdered women and their families deserve after nearly a decade in which no one has been brought to justice."
And we'll have more on law enforcement, plenty more actually, in a moment. But let's follow Brown a bit further. Let's learn more about these suspects. So Brown finds that the suspects have something similar going on with their web of relationships. While there are different suspects for different cases or different, specific murders, the suspects seem increasingly interrelated. Even Frankie Richard was briefly charged in 2007 for the murder of Lopez, but the charges were dropped when the witness statements were conflicting and then when a key piece of physical evidence was mishandled. And
it's definitely fishy.
Yeah, and Matt, you have some insight on Frankie Richards, correct?
Well, it comes from a series titled Murder in the Bayou, and there are just quotes there from Frankie Richard that just I wonder how much of it makes me feel as though he's like doing something morally wrong, and I just feel like there's some semblance of distrust in him just in general because of that, or it's just because of the way he words things. And I don't know how much of that can actually be attributed back to, the Jennings 8 murders, right? And I don't think any of it can, because it's just a feeling that I'm getting in reading these things. And I'm going to read this quote. You'll understand what I'm saying, but it's going to be a little bit, I'm going to use different words for what he's saying. "My most memorable way of making a living was selling pee. We sold pee any and every effing way we could. I did not pimp them girls. I introduced them to older men that wanted to spend some money on a young gal. I'm making sure they are getting their money, making sure they are not getting hurt."
Brokering sex is pimping.
Right?
That's not the quote. That's just a fact.
Yeah, I know. Well, and also just the way, again, like, maybe it's reading it. Maybe it's just, I'm imagining him saying that, and just that, the way he so nonchalantly is talking about it and then reflects back on it as in like, oh man, this was a great time in my life.
Well, he's also, he's a free man, but he's lived a hard life. If you hear any audio with him.
Yeah. And, and I'm not discounting that he's led a hard life. It's just, I'm just talking specifically about personal feeling from
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then here's one more quote just when we're talking about Frankie Richards. A family member of his, a niece and goddaughter named Hannah, talked about her uncle in this way. And this is a quote, again, from that same series. "Uncle Frankie was like the guy you didn't mess with. He took care of business." Which, again, like, it's more of like a character witness kind of thing. It has nothing to do with whether or not he actually did any of these crimes. It's just perhaps is one of the major reasons why he was a suspect, along with all the other evidence that was involved. But maybe there's just this air about him that would make him look good for it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and he did have knowledge, carnal and otherwise, of people who would later go on to be murdered in this course of events. There were other people charged in these cases, as we said. The men charged in the Patterson case, Byron Chad Jones and Lawrence Nixon, got off because of what may have been police incompetence. You could call it that, but it's sort of a glass half empty, glass half full situation, because our journalist, Brown, learned that the sheriff's office did not test the alleged crime scene until 15 months after Patterson's murder, and they were unable to demonstrate the presence of blood. Surprise, surprise, if you wait more than a year, that kind of organic evidence can get increasingly more difficult to detect. Mm-hmm. He also found evidence that other street-level criminals in Jennings especially people who were associated with Frankie Richard, were suspected in some of the other murders, but nothing came of it. And this task force was conducting exhaustive interviews. Nothing came of it. The law found no credible suspects. Yeah, and here's the thing, though. Corruption or incompetence, because what Brown starts calling the Jeff Davis 8 didn't just give info on the drug trade to the police when they were CIs. They apparently gave authorities information about other women in the trade and the community who would later turn up dead and be part of the Jefferson Davis 8 murders. Laconia Brown, the fifth victim, was interrogated about the 2005 killing of Ernestine Patterson, was, as you'll call the second victim. Brown said that he had Ethan Brown, our journalist, is not related to Laconia Muggy Brown.
Yes.
But he found a task force report where one of the witnesses claims that Brown spotted the body of Loretta Lewis, the first victim, floating in that canal before the fishermen found her body there in May of 2005. And then in 2006, detectives who were looking into that first murder also interrogated Kristen Gary Lopez, who later becomes the third victim. And Brown correctly faults the task force for not immediately noticing this troubling cavalcade of red flags. Here's what literally was happening. Women were being questioned in murder cases, and then shortly thereafter, they were turning up dead.
It's really tough because you never want to believe that law enforcement, could possibly even just be turning an eye, a blind eye, right? You never want to believe that could be happening. And we're certainly not saying that is what's happening. But just from the reporting of Ethan Brown, it definitely is making me personally question a lot of this stuff. And then you move on to the last victim, Nicole Guillory. She's another person who had a rap sheet that was pretty extensive with charges that were repeatedly dropped, which is something that should pique your interest, in what's called as a nolle prosequi. It's a ruling from the district attorney's office, the DA, and it just means to be unwilling to pursue.
Yeah, so we're prosecutors, and we're not saying that there's no sand to the charges, but for one reason or another, usually internal, we have decided not to prosecute.
Yeah, and it could be we don't want to put resources into this or for one reason or another. It could be that maybe there's something happening behind the scenes with this person that's being charged as, let's say, a CI or something. Right.
This is often used as a way to trade favors. You tell us about this other unrelated case off the books, and then we'll make this, this possession charge, something small time, go away. Guillory's mother, Barbara, noted that her daughter was increasingly paranoid in the days leading up to her disappearance, and one task force witness told Ethan Brown that Nicole Guillory, had said she knew who killed the other girls, the other 7 women. To this day, Barbara Guillory believes her daughter was murdered not by a serial killer, but by someone inside law enforcement because her daughter knew too much about the ongoing corruption. We even have a quote from Barbara here, which is pretty. You can tell that she has certitude about this. This is not something she suspects.
She used to tell us all the time it was the police killing the girls. That's what Barbara said. And we would reply, Nicole, a name, something, writes a letter and leaves it somewhere. Let us know. We can help you. No, Mama, it's too far gone. It's too big. I'd rather y'all not know nothing. That way nothing can happen to y'all. She knew, and that's why they killed her.
Brown found other similar reports. And still, at this point, this is all, witness testimony, and witness testimony can be unreliable, right? It can trend toward anecdote, and memory is a tricky, treacherous thing. But when you find multiple reports corroborating similar accounts, it becomes something you cannot ignore. Gail Brown, for instance, a sister of Muggy Brown, said shortly before her sister was killed, she told her family she was investigating a murder with a cop. And this cop was, I believe, supposed to give her $500 for information. But Gail also believes law enforcement murdered her sister. Ooh. So what's going on here? Why is a task force composed of local and state level and federal authorities pushing a narrative about a serial killer when multiple relatives and surviving witnesses are saying the same people, or some of the same people investigating these murders, are the same people who committed them? We'll explore this after a word from our sponsor.
And we're back.
Sort of.
Yes. We've been talking about how there are all these witnesses, and within this room, one of ours has left. We have gained a witness, that's me, and we've lost a witness, which is Noel Brown.
Yeah, I'm starting to wonder what you guys are getting up to.
Well, it's interesting. When you were not here recently, and the two of us were in the room, and we were talking with everyone who's also gathered here right now, just about your mysterious ways. I don't want to surprise you, Ben, but I think we are starting to develop some mysterious ways of our own.
Perhaps it's sketchiness by osmosis, right?
Yes.
By proximity. And I noticed this didn't happen until Seth, you started producing this show.
He's our guy on the inside.
And he's got this weird kind of malevolent smirk on while he's knitting.
What?
This is true. Yeah, Seth is knitting.
You think that's knitting? Dude.
I don't know.
He is stringing together thought tulpas right now. He's making a weapon.
I like it.
I don't know.
No, I like it. It reminds me of the Three Fates story, right? Well, we'll spin a golden thread in there for us, man. The fate of heroes, something. So we'll pick up. We do not know whether our good compatriot Noel is related to our journalist here, Ethan Brown, but hopefully Noel will be returning soon. And here we arrive at the point. Brown has to ask himself, is this a matter of incompetence or is it a matter of insidiousness? Is it just a bunch of people who are terrible at their jobs, or is it something more malevolent?
Well, yeah, and you'll recall in the beginning there, it definitely, or you at least have to give a bit of the benefit of the doubt and say, okay, if something is happening, it's probably incompetence. And now as he's gone further and further and further into this, he's thinking it's more corruption. Right.
And along the way, he is starting to get warning signs, little threats, cryptic hints. We should also, of course, to be completely fair, say that it's easy for someone on the outside without knowledge of law enforcement investigative processes to say something is incompetent, because law enforcement has to labor under a distinct set of rules. And there's one primary disadvantage that law enforcement always has, which is, in theory, law enforcement has to play by the rules and the bad guys do not.
Yes.
So if there's something that seems off kilter, if there's something that seems like it doesn't add up, just like any time you investigate something like this, you have to realize that what can appear to be conspiracy can often be explained by incompetence or mistake or user error, essentially.
Yeah, or just a regulation didn't allow for one thing or another to happen.
Right. Or because of a technical problem with the chain of command for evidence, for instance, someone that everyone knows is a murderer walks free. That happens.
Yeah.
That happens because the law is not perfect. So Brown does his due diligence, and he says, you know what? This could have been incompetence, but incompetence does not explain the enormity of what's happening here in Louisiana. He says what appears to be incompetence might be out-and-out corruption. And this is when he begins to learn what we should call the oral history of the dark side of Jennings, Louisiana. The old street heads, people have been in and out of the system for decades. They tell him that corruption in this little part of Louisiana dates all the way back to the 1970s when cops got involved in the other side of the drug trade, where they were selling the drugs or getting a vig, right?
Yeah, or at least allowing it to occur with some beneficial thing, right? But then he keeps going down the rabbit hole about the local law enforcement, right? And we've got a quote.
Yeah, we've got a quote. As he's going down the rabbit hole, he learns more and more. We pulled just a few examples that I thought were powerful to show you that if there is corruption related to the murder of the Jefferson Davis 8, then this corruption itself is part of a larger pattern. It didn't happen out of the blue. That's, again, if law enforcement is responsible for the murders. Here's the quote. Brown writes, in March of 1990, 2 local men burglarized the sheriff's office, making off with a staggering 300 pounds of marijuana. When investigators interviewed one of the burglars, according to court documents, he named a surprising pair of accomplices, Frankie Richard and a man named Ted Gary. Ted Gary is interesting because he was the chief deputy sheriff at the time. Brown notes that there were no charges ever brought against Richard and Gary.
And let's just keep going here because there's another quote. Quote, 3 years later in 1993, Sheriff Dallas Cormier pleaded guilty in federal court to 1 count of obstruction of justice after he was charged with crimes ranging from improper dealings with inmates to using public funds to buy trucks, tires, and guns for himself.
And then in October of 2003, 8 female cops on the Jennings force filed a civil rights lawsuit against the Jennings police chief, Donald Lucky DeLuche, and then a bunch of other male cops and the city of Jennings itself, and they said there were widespread acts of sexual violence and harassment. Amongst the allegations in the complaint, there were things like a captain who would shake his genitals at female officers and say things like, I like to lick, as you said, Matt, pee. I can numb it all night. People who forced oral sex on female officers, a lieutenant who waved a knife at a female officer saying that, he was going to cut her up. And then in January 2013, just think about this. This goes back from 1990, these specific examples, to 2013. In 2013, a former police chief, Johnny Lasseter, gets hit with a ton of charges after Louisiana State Police fined $4,500 in cash, 1,800 pills, more than 380 grams of cocaine, and pounds of marijuana missing from the department's evidence room.
Wow.
The evidence room, by the way, is a sieve.
Yeah, it's exactly. Well, and who knows how many officers were actually involved in the, movement of all of those materials that were found missing, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, the sheriff is blamed there in that case because this is your evidence room.
And I think it's so intellectually lazy and tempting when we hear these stories to say, well, all cops are bad. Or all these people, everybody who works at this department from the bottom up, they're all rotten. It's jerks all the way up and jerks all the way down. That's not true. In this case, there's a former sergeant named Jesse Ewing. In 2007, he hears that 2 female inmates at the city jail want to talk because they say they have knowledge about the murders and that higher-ranking officers were directly involved, at least in the cover-up of the murders. At this time, again, 2007, if we remember our timeline, there were 4 victims.
And this has really got Ewing, it's got his mind really stirred up because he's already had a lot of suspicions about stuff that's been going on or things that he's felt were possibly going on. He was concerned that the recording of, the interviews, the tapes of these 2 particular inmates might, disappear in the same way that all that stuff, like the drugs, the cash, all of those things in the evidence locker and the evidence room, all that stuff had been disappearing. He was thinking somebody's just going to erase this from the records. So he ends up giving the tapes to a private investigator named Kirk Menard, and then he, in turn, sent them on to the Federal Bureau of Investigation office in Lake Charles.
This plan backfires. It turns out that Ewing is right not to trust his fellow officers and his colleagues because the tapes end back up with the task force, MAIT, and Sergeant Ewing is concerned that there will be reprisals if he goes through the regular channels. That's why he went through a PI to the FBI. It turns out he was right, because as soon as those tapes end up at MAIT, the Jefferson Davis District Attorney Office charges this sergeant with malfeasance in office, as well as a trumped-up charge of sexual misconduct. One of the female inmates who's on the audio tapes says that he touches her inappropriately while they are recording. These charges are later dismissed. The tapes contain specific information about the murders of Dubois and Lopez, including allegations that law enforcement helped cover up the role of one Frankie Richard in at least one of the murders. So we get to a bit of secondhand information here, but it's interesting. Walk with us on this. So one of the people on the tapes, who remains publicly unidentified today, says that she heard from a different person working in the sex trade that Richard and his niece, Hannah Connor, are the ones who killed Whitney Dubois. And furthermore, this sex worker, Tracy, says that she was there the night it happened. She saw it occurring. She says they'd all been getting high, and when Dubois refused Richard's sexual advances, he got aggressive. He started fighting with her, and when she started fighting back, he got on top of her and began punching her. According to this inmate, that's when the niece held Dubois' head back and drowned her. Ordinarily, you could see why this should be treated with skepticism, right?
Yeah.
Like, I'm an inmate in a jail.
Mm-hmm.
I'm telling you something someone else said to me, and I wasn't there. And it's just another person that I know from the streets who's probably going to be in jail later.
Well, yeah, and if you think about the cost-benefit thing there, right? Are you going to get – what are you getting in return for giving information like that, right?
Right.
And – if it comes back that, oh, wait, this person says that they didn't say that, well, then, I mean, all you have to say is, well, they must be mistaken because that's what they said to me.
Right. And it's hearsay. What's the motive?
Yeah.
You know, maybe they just have some kind of vendetta against that other person in the community and they want to get them jammed up. The problem is this tracks with a confession that same person who said she was in the room made earlier that same year. The two inmates claim there was a conspiracy afoot, that Frankie Richard and a high-ranking member of the sheriff's office named Warren Gary worked together to destroy the evidence of Lopez's murders.
And if that was true, they were probably working together in some other capacity, or at least there was a payoff. There was some benefit to Warren Gary, if that is true. And Gary himself was never actually charged. In fact, he ended up getting promoted to run the evidence room.
Yes. Yeah, it's true.
Like think about that. It's not confirmed, all of this stuff, but like just the perfect placement if it were true to be placed there in charge of the evidence room. And he ended up leaving the sheriff's office sometime around 2012.
Yes. And he's just, there are multiple other suspects. Brown found a multitude of allegations regarding the case. And these allegations were in various parts of the task force reports, but they were not made public until his research brought them to life. So, Mr. Brown, if you are listening, thank you for your courage and your diligent efforts here. Enter a fellow named Danny Barry. Before dying in 2010 at the age of 63, Danny Barry worked for the sheriff's office for 12 years. 3 separate witnesses named him as a suspect in murders during interviews in 2008. They claimed, first, that Barry and his wife would drive around, pick up women off the street, and then drug them, specifically spike their drinks. Some of these women also said that Barry had a room in his trailer cordoned off from the rest of the domicile, that there were chains hanging from the ceiling. This was a room people could, quote, not see in or out of. Barry was interviewed by the task force on February 25th, 2009. He was not asked about any of these allegations.
Yeah, of course not. But that is, oh gosh, it's so tough. It's so tough with these kinds of things because it's a cumulative effect, right? I mean, that's the same thing that happened to Ethan Brown here that's happening to me, I think, maybe to you listening to this, to Ben and all of us. Just it's a cumulative effect of feeling like something is fully rotten in I was going to say Denmark, but in Jennings. And for this guy to be what was that quote there? We said he was not a suspect in 3 murders. He was brought up. What was it? They named him. He was named by somebody as a suspect in 3 of the Jennings 8 murders. That's pretty weird. But then there is a whole other twist that, Ben, you found here. Something about one of the victims was present during a police shooting?
So, yes. So it turns out that there's another connection. So we have the hotel, the location through which they're often connected. We have their acquaintances, male, female, colleagues, fellow drug users, and so on. And then we have an incident in 2005. Police fatally shot a local drug dealer named Leonard Crochet. A grand jury investigated this shooting and determined that there was no probable cause for a charge of negligent homicide on the officer's part or against the police at all in the case, even though the dealer was provably unarmed when he was murdered. Witnesses told investigators multiple times that they believed police were killing victims who knew about how this shooting went down. At least one of the Jennings 8 was in the room when this fatal shooting occurred, and you can read some pretty harrowing, in-depth accounts of that. But if that is true, then it seems that these victims were being murdered to cover up a dirty shooting, right?
Yeah.
And then how dirty is the shooting? Well, that depends on how dirty the law enforcement personnel were working there.
Well, yeah. Well, we've kind of, if you're to believe some of the picture that's been painted here through this reporting, then you may think, wow, I guess if, if the police officers who were involved with some of this stuff did end up needing to take somebody out with whom they were involved, then yeah, you can just imagine how dirty the dealings actually were. And there's this other thing here. A warden named Terry Guillory was trafficking some of the inmates, the female inmates, for sex.
Or, maybe it's like Richard said, maybe he was just introducing them to men who wanted to exchange money.
Old men who wanted money. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Ugh.
Unclean.
And here's this other thing. Warren Gary, who we were talking about up top there, he purchased a truck on the cheap from a friend of Richard, Frankie Richard that we were talking about there. And this truck may have been used in a murder and then later sold. This is a thing. This is like let's just put that out there. I'm just saying kind of thing, right?
Right. Also, Guillory is a cousin of that last victim, Nicole Guillory.
Ooh.
Yeah, and again, a lot of this goes into things that we would have to call hearsay.
Yeah. Oh, a ton of this is.
There are very sketchy timelines, strange relationships, but right now, despite these troubling things, there are no convicted murderers in any of these cases. And given the increasingly shady activities of law enforcement in the investigation, it's no surprise that the then Sheriff Edwards required all task force members to get swabbed for DNA, if for nothing more than to put the public at ease. Tut, though, because it turns out that the results of those DNA tests were never disclosed to the public and have not been at the time of this recording. This is where you come in. Public knowledge of the story may help with the case. It's been covered pretty well in several different venues, most recently in the 2019 5-part documentary, Murder in the Bayou, which you had mentioned earlier, Matt. But these murders remain unsolved. There are numerous people pointing their fingers at folks in the sex trade, folks in the drug trade, some people still pushing the serial killer narrative, and, of course, people pointing their fingers at former members of law enforcement. This is where we want to hear from you. Now, Claude, to answer the question you had asked us earlier, is the Jennings 8 or the Jefferson Davis 8 an inspiration for True Detective Season 1? There are some notable differences, of course, because True Detective Season 1 is clearly a work of fiction, but the creator of the show, Nick Pizzolatto, says that he was not aware of the Jennings case until after True Detective was coming out. And he in fact tweeted about this approvingly in 2014 when Ethan Brown in his Medium article noted that this felt like a True Detective story. So we have not found any statement, at least from the creator of the show, that he was inspired by this. However, we will point out that during the run of True Detective Season 1, the creator came under some fairly serious criticism, including plagiarism, right, for some of, I think it was specifically some of the dialogue Rust Cole speaks, right?
And I can't remember the writer from whom it was believed he was borrowing, but it's the weird fiction.
Thomas Ligotti.
That's it. That's it. Yeah. There are similarities here for sure, but the corruption within the police department thing feels a little different to me. I'm having a hard time fully recalling True Detective Season 1. I think I need to rewatch it.
It's fantastic. It's fantastic work, and I'm glad that it's fiction. The problem here, I don't know, not the problem, but the complication here is that fiction has a complicated relationship with the truth. We have cases where real-life events become embellished in works of fiction, but then we also have cases where works of fiction create real-life tragedies and crimes, such as the infamous Slender Man stabbings. Slender Man was, is acknowledged to be an urban legend created on the internet. The people who made Slender Man say that they made it and didn't, quote unquote, discover it.
Oh yeah, yes. But in this case, it is that too. It's a lot of people saying a lot of things without a ton of evidence to back any of it up, and that's why we're very much interested in what you think. To my money, it feels like a combination of things that we've discussed here, of people that may be implicated in very small, very minor ways, and then others in pretty major ways. And I still feel like that Frankie Richards guy. He gives me just a bad feeling.
Frankie Richard, yeah. Yep. Here's the thing. At least 8 people are dead. And one of the big questions is, did they all know each other because they just happened to run in the same circles, happened to live in the same relatively small town or relatively sparsely populated area, or were they all targeted, right? We know that this murder rate is incredibly high for the population, and it's abnormal. There's no way around it. No matter who you think is responsible, there's no way around that. I am going to voice my opinion. I believe that police corruption is heavily involved. If you look at the track record, and again, this is no ding on the people currently working in law enforcement, But if you look at the track record of things that had happened over the course of the decades leading to these murders, and if you look at how the murders were handled, then it seems to me fairly obvious that there was at least some corruption and cover-up at play. And, it's tempting to say, well, was this were they killed by members of the drug trade? Were they killed by members of law enforcement? When you get past a certain threshold of corruption, the drug trade and law enforcement are very close to being the same thing. Their fingers on a hand. Now, I'm not saying there's a case like that because, I've never sold weight on the Interstate 10 corridor. I've never had to pay off a Louisiana member of law enforcement.
I like that you're specific, giving it such specifics there.
Those are the specifics. Right?
I know they
That's
are, but
what would have to happen.
I know, but your statement is just so specific.
Oh, do you think I'm going to say I-75? That's a different story.
No,
Yeah.
I'm just joking. I
But it's true,
was
though.
hoping you would say I've never sold weight. I've never
I've never sold weight on the I-10 corridor. And I've never made a deal with the good folks in Jennings, Louisiana.
Yeah. Well, sorry, I'm making light of it just because it is uncomfortable talking about the deaths of individuals like this, where corruption, like you said, has a track record, and it seems that it at least had some hand in it.
And Brown was onto something. Brown is onto something. He was threatened. He did have to stay out of the area for several months. It can be enormously dispiriting to admit that this is a situation where the law has failed. Has the law failed because it is imperfect, or has the law purposefully been made to fail here? The fact that I would argue that the fact that these crimes remain unsolved presents us and presents you listening an opportunity to be part of the solution.
Yes. So contact us in whatever way you choose or whatever way you prefer the most. You can find us on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. We're Conspiracy Stuff on some of those, Conspiracy Stuff Show on Instagram. If you don't want to contact us that way, you can join our Facebook group. That's a really great way to have discussions. It's called Here's Where It Gets Crazy. A lot of fine people in that group. Even finer people running it, right?
There we go.
And if you don't want to do that stuff, you can give us a call. Our number is 1-833-STDWYTK. And leave us a message. Tell us your story. If you want to protect your identity, call from a burner phone or a Google Voice number or something like that, because I do see your numbers when you call in. Just a word of warning. And if you don't want to do that, you can send us a good old-fashioned email. We are
conspiracy@iHeartRadio.com.
Stuff They Don't Want You to Know is a production of iHeartRadio. For more podcasts from iHeartRadio, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.